I'm delighted today to introduce Dr. Gordon T. Smith as our plenary speaker this morning. Dr. Smith has served as the president of Ambrose University here in Calgary since August of 2012, where he also holds a teaching position as professor of systematic and spiritual theology. He is also a teaching fellow at Regent College in Vancouver. Dr. Smith completed his PhD studies at the Loyola School of Theology, a part of the Ateneo de Manila University, a Jesuit university in the Philippines. He has authored a number of books, including most recently, Called to be Saints, An Invitation to Christian Maturity in 2014. Dr. Smith is married to Joella, and together they have 2 adult sons. This morning, Dr. Smith will be speaking on vocation and the call to a discerning love. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Smith.
The Lord be with you. There should have been 2 responses to that invitation, to that call, and I think I heard 2. And with your spirit for our Catholic brothers and sisters, and also with you for our Protestant evangelical brothers and sisters. Delighted to be with you today, and on behalf of or alongside of your Calgary colleagues, I welcome you to this city. Delighted to have you here, and indeed trust that the benediction of the triune God will rest upon you and empower you and equip you for the work to which you are called, which is so critical to the purposes of God in our world for such a time as this. It is my privilege to speak to the theme of love, and I cannot commend you strongly enough for choosing such a theme. As was suggested, it is so basic to our Christian identity and to our Christian calling. And when we use the language love and calling together, it is important that we make a distinction. And the distinction, of course, is that while we are all called to love, the distinction is that we are all not called to love in the very same way. And one of the things that I think I have had to push against in my own upbringing, coming out of my own religious subculture, is that the need does not determine the call. It is all too easy for us because God has loved us, and we have responded, and I trust generously to the love of God, and thus seek to love others as God has loved us. To assume then that the love of God means that we are going to respond in every which way we can to the expression of love to which we think perhaps that we are called. But the fact of the matter is that the need cannot determine the call because for the very simple reason that we are not, how do I break this to you gently, we are not messiahs. We are not heroes. We can't do everything. And thus it is imperative that we learn, that we grow in the capacity, and it's a lifelong discernment process, that we grow in the capacity to discern the particular ways in which God is calling us, individually or perhaps in community, but more of the focus this morning will be individually. How God is calling us individually to be expressions of the love of God for God's world. And when you bring the 2 themes together, love and vocation, what you find is that over the last, 20, 25 years or so, there has been a very stimulating conversation around the theme of vocation and calling. It has, of course, been attendant to a very dynamic reflection on a theology of work, of vocation, and career, that when these 3 themes are brought together, it is helpful to think of all of the diverse ways in which God is calling people into every sphere and sector of society. But what is also highlighted there is the need for each of us to ask the following question. What is the good work to which I am called? The good work that will, of course, be the means by which I express the love of God for others, for God's world. What is the good work to which I am called? And you need to be able to answer this question if you're going to be able to live well. It's one of the big questions of life, you might say. What is the good work to which I have been called? And to that end this morning, the good work to which I am called is the means by which I am going to express the love of God for others and for the world. To that end, it seems to me that there are 6 questions that have kind of emerged out of the last, as I said, there's been this conversation over the last 25 years or so around the theme of vocation, work, and career. There are 6 questions that it seems to me have kind of percolated to the surface out of that conversation. And I'm going to speak to them this morning, summarize them for you this morning, in a sense, bring them to the surface to this end, to foster good conversation, that you should have people in your life who are able to ask you the question, what is the good work to which you are called? And if you were to ask me that question, what is the good work to which I, that is you, have been called? I would say, well, let's go for a walk. And as we go for a walk, these are the 6 questions that I'm going to ask of you. That is, I'm not going to be your kind of lucky golden star, and I'll tell you the good work to which you're called. Rather, let me ask you 6 questions as kind of the precursor, as the means to the end, to help you discern the good work to which you are called. Question number 1. This is the question that locates our work in the purposes of God. It is necessarily the first question, and it is the question, what on earth is God doing? You see, the reason why this question is so important is because in a Christian understanding of work, our work is but a participation in the work of God. And therefore, we cannot properly discern our own vocations, what is the good work to which I am called, unless we're able to locate that within the broader purposes of the Creator and Redeemer of all things. And indeed, God is a worker. And the Psalms celebrate God as Creator and Redeemer. And we have this extraordinary privilege to participate in the work of God, to be co-creators with God, to be brought in to the work that God is already doing as Creator, and the work that God is already doing as Redeemer. And our work then becomes a participation in the work of God. It is helpful, it seems to me, to think of it. I think of a couple of illustrations. One is if you were to ask a farmer, what is she growing? You might say to her. And she would look at you somewhat askance. What do you mean, what am I growing? I'm not growing anything. And you respond by saying, well, I was just walking out of the fields and I saw you're growing something. It looks like corn. Is it corn? And she says, don't be ridiculous. Of course I'm not growing corn. I planted the corn. I assure you I'm watering it, or hoping that the heavens would water it. I weed, of course, but I am most assuredly am not growing the corn. It's growing while I'm even sleeping. All I'm doing is participating in the work that the Creator is doing. And the genius of great farming, of course, is that indeed she knows how God grows things, and she can participate with alacrity, but also with sophistication, with skill in the purposes of God. If I went to my general practitioner, Art Harper, good man, good doctor, and after I've had a parasite that I've picked up in Mexico, and I came to Art and I said, oh, Art, it's gone. The parasite's gone. My digestive system's all kind of come around. This is terrific. You are a wonderful healer. Dear Art, he would just recoil and toss me out of his office in no time at all. He would say, I am most assuredly not a healer. Why? Because as a medical practitioner, he knows full well that there's only one healer, and that, of course, is the one who is creating and redeeming all things, and that in his work as a medical practitioner, all he's doing is participating in the work of God. And that principle applies to every vocation, that all work is but a participation in what God is already doing. And in my work as a seminary president, I'm a university president, but within the university there's also a seminary, and we need to belabor this point with our seminary students, that however gifted they may be as preachers and teachers within congregations, they do not make it happen. They don't deliver the mail. All they do is their part, and I trust faithfully and skillfully and winsomely and in ways that are faithful to the text and to the ancient traditions of the Christian faith. But ultimately, if transformation comes, let it not go to their heads that they think they are the heroes and the messiahs. Rather, who was the one who brings about the redemption of all things? Our work is but a participation in the work of God. And yet what is crucial for us to realize is that when we participate in the work of God, God calls women and men into every sphere and sector of society. I grew up within a religious subculture that had as its proclivity, you might say, to privilege certain tasks and responsibilities. And thus, my father was wont to say, oh, Gordon, and he would say this to others, we must be about the Lord's work. I can't quite say it like he could say it, the Lord's work. I would love to be able to at least mimic my father on this score. And by the Lord's work, he does not mean the work of a medical practitioner. He did not mean the work of my dentist. He did not mean the work of scholarship and teaching, which is my day job. He did not mean the work of building buildings or the work of a police officer or the work of. He meant religious work. He meant work within the context of a faith community and of the church. And this was the work that was privileged. in my upbringing. And for me, growing up, it was just taken for granted that if I was someone who loved Jesus, I would become a missionary. And if failing that, well, then maybe the next best thing would be to become a pastor. And that would be pretty close. Not as good, but almost as good. And failing that, I would do something that could generate enough revenue to support the people that were doing, and I'll say it again, the Lord's work. And despite the fact that I grew up within a tradition that was heir to the Protestant Reformation, it was deep and it remains deep in our DNA. Even at Ambrose University, many of our business students do not think of business as a legitimate calling. And the only reason why they think they're going to do business is because it will get them into what they call limited access countries, where they will have a business visa in order to be able to do what they're really called to do. That will be their cover, meaning they're not really business people. And by the way, all the neighbors in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, whatever country they're in, they all know they're not real business people. It's obvious. And that presumably this will get them into the country so they can do the real work of God, which of course is religious work. It flies in the face of the Protestant evangelical theological tradition. That is, it is just not consistent with our deep understanding of the ways that God is at work in the world. And it was interesting in January to be part of a consultation in Austin, Texas, where I was meeting with a whole group of people out of Asian American traditions. These are Asian American immigrant, but they're second and third generation Asian Americans. And they're wrestling with this whole question of what they call the privileging of certain callings or vocations, occupations, and how Asian Americans are pressed by their faith communities, but also by their parents, into either engineering or law or medicine, and everything else is viewed as not just second best, but just simply an illegitimate option. And I was introduced in that conversation to this wonderful phrase. He says, Asian Americans, the one fellow said, we lack vocational imagination. Ooh, what a wonderful phrase. And I thought, yes. Do our children have vocational imagination? And do we encourage it? Or do we assume that we as their parents already kind of have a sense that given the fact that our grandfathers were in medicine, and our fathers and mothers perhaps were in medicine, and we're in medicine, and there's this wonderful family tradition, or do we have the vocational imagination that allows our children to be what they are being called by their Heavenly Father to be? And do our faith communities, our churches, have the vocational imagination to realize that on Sunday morning, women and men are being called into every sphere and sector of society, and that the inbreaking of the kingdom happens not on Sunday morning when we gather for worship, but rather on Monday morning as women and men are being called into every sphere and sector of society, and that the purpose of the church, in part, not in the whole, but in part, is to equip and empower them for the work that they are being called to do as God does God's work, again, in every sphere and sector of society. One of the urgent needs we have then is to foster a vocational imagination wherein then we ask of one another, where is God capturing your imagination? Where do you see the inbreaking of the Creator and Redeemer at work within the world? Where do you sense the movements of your own heart responding to the ways in which God as Creator and Redeemer is bringing about the purposes of God, and you get to be a player on God's stage? Secondly, there's almost a sense in which the second question should only come as a comma after the first, because you cannot merely ask the first question. You have to almost very quickly ask the second question, and yea, who are you? Or as I ask it of myself, and who am I? Calvin's Institutes open with the articulation that wisdom is found at the intersection of the knowledge of God and the knowledge of our humanity, the knowledge of God and the knowledge of self. We are not truly wise women and men, and we will not live in freedom and truth unless we know the ways of God, yes, of course, but also that we're able to see our own selves in truth, to name the reality of who we are, to see ourselves in truth, as Catherine of Siena put it, as Teresa of Avila put it. This is humility. This is true humility, to see ourselves as God sees us, to see ourselves in a way that is consistent with the way that God has wired us. If we were to take this walk, we would start from the Fairmount Palliser right here, and my first question would be, of course, well, what on earth is God doing? But as we moved a block away from here, we come by where the Calgary Philharmonic does its orchestral masterpieces. I was there about 6 weeks ago, and it was just a spectacular evening of Brahms and Strauss, piano, orchestra. The prior conductor was visiting back. We come back to the parking lot just down the street. We sit in the car, and I don't start the car right away, and Joella says, "I know what you're thinking." Yes, I missed my calling. I missed my calling. I don't know. There is just something. There's just something magical, magisterial. I mean, I just think, if I could only be a symphony orchestra conductor. That's my kind of only aspiration in life. I mean, it's just, she knows. I mean, as a child, I used to kind of conduct Tchaikovsky's symphony before the record player. Do you know what a record player is, young people? But it's the precursor to the cassette tapes. You don't even know what that is, the precursor to the CD. But I know Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture backwards and forwards because I've conducted it so many times as a child. The sheer exhilaration, the sense of power, the sense of magic, the sense of all these instruments coming together, the sense of a composer's piece that he is long gone, she is long gone, but now it is yet alive. Somehow, you can see how much this clearly is my calling, and I missed it. And my wife, this is why I guess we marry, because these kinds of words get spoken after such kinds of events, when she says, "But it just really isn't you." And you kind of, that's, I guess, why we marry, so that reality can be named occasionally. Yeah. No, it isn't me. And every so often, on the campus of the university, and the chair of the history department, he knows. I wander down the hall, and I'm sitting in his office, and he knows something about my history. And so he knows that I feel that in actual fact, he's in my place. Because you see, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Regina, I was a history major, and frankly, Professor Zagorin, the chair of the history department, he was just a giant. He was a huge man physically, but he was a huge man intellectually. Nobody, in a sense, in all of my up to my undergraduate years, nobody demonstrated for me the brilliance of great scholarship quite as much as Professor Zagorin did. And, well, I wanted to be a historian. And I thought, well, maybe I would be a history prof in a high school, and maybe if I really was good at it, I could actually be a history prof in a university, and then one day, like Professor Zagorin, I could chair a history department. And however taken I was with him, two of my closest friends are historians. And whenever they hear me tell that story, they say, "Whew, that was close. So oh, Gordon, no, you are, yeah, I know I'm not a historian. I'm just telling you, I was very taken with history as a young man. And I still read history, but I'm not a historian. I find, frankly, all those details and facts just bothersome. They get in the way. The details are just, why do we need to be so precise? I'm going to use history tonight, but I would never do what I'm going to do tonight with a group, with the Canadian Historical Society. Not a chance. I'm hoping I can get away with it tonight with medical practitioners and dentists, as I draw on the history of the church, but I look at broad themes. I look at principles that emerge, but don't bother me with the facts. I'm being only half facetious, I hope you know, but I'm not a historian. I am not a historian. I'm not an orchestra conductor. However much I am taken with how God works through orchestras or how God works through history and historiography, however moving and exciting I find that to be, in actual fact, it isn't me. And thus, part of the genius of discerning the ways in which God is calling us to be instruments of His love is that we ask a question such as, "Yea, who am I? And can I look at myself," as the Apostle Paul puts it in Romans chapter 12, "with sober judgment, with the judgment of humility, with the graciousness, not only to see myself in truth," but again, back to the words of Catherine of Siena and Teresa of Avila, "but to graciously accept who I am, and oh God, grant me this grace to stop wishing I were anybody else than who I am." That is part of the genius of discerning vocation, to stop wishing that you were anybody other than who you are. And don't ask me when this comes, because I'm in my early 60s and still working on it. That is, every so often you bump up and you say, but no, you back up and say, but this is who God made when God made me. And that part of humility and grace and gratitude is to embrace that in response to the call of God, and then to get to ask some hard questions of ourselves. And one of the things that's emerging in the conversation, as I mentioned, over the last 20, 25 years about vocation, one of the things that's emerging is that one of the most powerful questions to ask of oneself to foster self-knowledge, one of the most powerful questions to ask is the question, what is it that matters to you? I think, for example, of Peter Block in his book, The Answer to How is Yes, and White, I forget his first name, David White, Vocation is a Pilgrimage of Identity. Both of them speak to this question of seeking to find out what it is that matters to you, and perhaps matters to you more than anything else. What is it, for example, that makes you angry because it makes God angry? And when I say this, I say it somewhat tentatively because some people get angry all too easily. If you get angry because you've been cut off in traffic, I just say, leave the car home, take public. If you're going to get angry about the big things. Get angry about what it is that disturbs the heart of God. And it's a way, in a sense, to get into your own heart, to your own knowledge of self, recognizing this, though, that anger cannot drive your vocation. Rather, anger might be an occasion to discern it, but if we are driven by anger, our work will always be done with the sharp, not the sharp edge of a surgeon's knife, but the rough edge. It will be harsh. It will not be a genuine, peace-filled, shalom-filled participation in the purposes of God. And for me as a young man in my mid-30s, I moved gradually, first just because somebody needed to fill in for a sabbatical. I moved into an administrative role, and I realized two things early on there in my mid-30s. Not only one, that I could do administration and do it relatively well. I don't have any of my colleagues here to verify that, so you're just going to have to take it from me. But also that it mattered to me, and that when poor governance happened, I was living in the Philippines at the time, and I ached. I ached for the Filipino people. And I ached for them because they were a beautiful and a good people. They didn't deserve poor governance. And I saw, indeed, how a whole people, a whole nation, can suffer when there's poor governance. And coming back from the Philippines once on a visit to Canada, we came through Switzerland. And we were visiting, I was lecturing actually at Mittersill in Austria, and we took a train into Switzerland. And as we were changing trains, we noticed on the board this announcement that the train was due to arrive at 11:54 and leave at 11:58. And I thought, yeah, right. I don't understand sometimes these things, why they don't just say, and we'll leave around noon. Having come from Asia, around noon is fine, everywhere, of course, but Hong Kong and Singapore. We'll leave when we're ready to go. When everybody's on board, then we'll go. And so I was just curious, how precise actually are these Swiss when it comes to their trains? Well, you probably know where my story's going. I'm standing there on the pier, on the platform, and the train is due to arrive at 11:55, and I watch it come around the corner, this huge, massive machine, and it begins to slow down, and I'm watching it to my left in my peripheral vision. I'm watching this clock, this analog clock, with the second hand. And my friends, as the second hand's coming up, the train is coming in, and it kind of heaves the sigh as the second hand hits the top. Unbelievable. We jump on the train. I move. Usually, Joella, my wife, gets the seat by the window, but I wanted the seat by the window so I could watch the clock. We wait. The second hand's coming around again. As it moves slowly to the top, I'm thinking, we're not going to leave at 11:58. That second hand hits 11:58, and you can feel this massive machine just make that very subtle little shift. Unbelievable. I want to break into the doxology. It is a thing of utter and absolute beauty. And my wife, Joella, she says, I guess this is you because there are magnificent Alps all around you, but all you can see is the way that this thing runs. Indeed, a well-run railway is a beautiful thing. And it's not just, of course, a matter of efficiency. There was a deep humanity with which the Swiss run their trains. I felt cared for. I knew this thing was going to work. It was well governed. And it's no wonder then that I personally have moved into governance and that I'm deeply committed to it and every day trying to master the craft because it matters. What is it that matters to you? Matters to you enough that you're going to give your life energy to it. Matters to you enough because you know that as God has loved you and you are called to love others, that this is how, indeed, God is inviting you to exercise the skills, the capacities, the abilities that He has given to you. I have not used the word passion, in part because I have English professors on my campus for whom they disdain the word. They think we use it so poorly, but they're not here. But what is the passion that God has placed in your heart? You need to be discerning. It needs to be consistent with what God is doing. When somebody called into business says, my only passion is to make $1 million by the time I'm 30, I say, oh God, grant this young man, this young woman a capacity to enter into business because they want to serve, and even through business, yea, through business, to be an instrument of the love of God. Thirdly, when we ask the vocation question, one of the things that's emerged in the last 20, 25 years, and perhaps some of the most powerful voices have come from adult psychological development, is that we need to ask this question, or recognize that as we respond to this question, we ask it and we respond to it differently in our 20s, in our 40s, and in our 60s. Adult psychological development theorists have helped us to see, and probably the most powerful voice, at least in my estimation, the most powerful voice is James Fowler. And I commend to you particularly his book published in 1984. I still don't think there's been anything published, but, for some people in my world, that is like ancient history. But it's not. I don't think anything has improved on his brilliant piece, Becoming Adult, Becoming Christian, in which he draws us into a conversation where we wrestle about matters of vocation differently as young adults, as mid-career adults, and as adults moving into our senior years. We're always asking the question, what is the good work to which we are called? But the young adults who make up the bulk of the population of the university where I serve, they're wrestling with this in a very different way from their parents and from their grandparents. And without doubt, one of the most critical issues that young adults face is the question of differentiation or individuation. Will they be their own person with respect to their parents? Will they move from adolescence to adulthood? Will they assume adult responsibility for their life? When I was an undergraduate, I went to the University of Regina, just down Highway number 1. My parents, I can assure you, did not show up opening day or any day. Any chance that my parents were going to be on the campus of the university, there's odds were I was not going to be on the campus that day. But the times, they have changed. And when we have our fall orientation for new entry-level students, and it's always on Labor Day in our institution, their parents show up in droves. That is, the cars start coming down the road, and there's 3 people in every car: mom, dad, entry-level student, frosh, freshman, whatever language you want to use. And I think the times, they have changed. And so, indeed, we have an orientation for all the new entry-level students from wherever they're coming from, to the university, to our programs, our activities, and everything. But we also have an orientation for the parents. And they, of course, ask about the residences, the policies, the practices, why the rates, the tuition rates are what they are. They ask all kinds of questions about food, and understandable. And then the president, yours truly, I get some time with them as well. And I did it for the first time this last fall, and I'm going to do it again this fall. I'm going to talk to them about how these are years in which these are critical years in the formation of these young women and men as they come to an adult awareness of who they are. And the only way this is going to work is if you go home. That's kind of like how this works. Now, we would like you to go by the finance office on the way to the parking lot. I don't want to, you don't want to offend these people. I mean, you want to be on very, very good terms with these people. You'd like them to be long-term supporters of the institution. But the only way this is going to work is if you go home. And I really enjoyed it last fall. I was actually out in the parking lot visiting with a couple that I'd known for many, many years and hadn't crossed paths with them for a while. I was standing by their car, and I could hear people calling to one another, new friends who had discovered other parents that day, yelling at each other, "Go home." So it became kind of the mantra of the day. And indeed, they do need to go home. And now these young women and men need to say, without my parents in the room, without the social, geographic proximity, without the spiritual proximity, now with some distance, conscious of, deeply knowledgeable of their deep love and affirmation for me, now in the company of other adults who are mentors and teachers and blessers, how is God calling me? Secondly, it seems to me Fowler is right that one of the most crucial parts of our mid-adult years is that we come to a gracious acceptance, as he puts it, of our strengths and of our limitations. In a sense, we haven't lived long enough in our 20s and even into our 30s to be able to answer this question. But after you've lived with yourself for a while, you should know, so what are the strengths that I bring to the table? But what also are the limits? And for Fowler, it's important that we use the word limits, not weaknesses. I'm not so much interested in your strengths and your weaknesses as your strengths and your limits. Because as Fowler puts it, God, as often as not, calls us to function according to our strengths, but also to lean on and to work in interdependence with those who have complementary strengths. And I will not be, I will think of myself as a hero and as a Messiah if I don't realize in midlife that I cannot do even my own vocation unless I learn to lean upon the strengths of others, and I lean upon the strengths of others by recognizing my own limits. That there comes, you might say, a gracious acceptance, as I put it earlier this morning, that we are not all that we might like to be, but we are the person that God created us to be, and we stop wishing that we were anybody other than who we are. And finally, as we move into our senior years, there is no doubt a letting go. I do not know within your profession how retirement works. For those of you that read the Globe and Mail yesterday, the Globe and Mail had a whole section on a gentleman by the name of Jack Lewis, who's being kind of, discussed or reflected upon by the AMA about whether or not he, at age 81, is still able to faithfully be a practitioner of his trade as a GP, as a general practitioner, as a medical doctor. Can he do it at age 81? We will not take a vote. Rather this, in virtually, if not all, occupations/vocations, there's a gracious acceptance that when we move into our senior years, God is calling us to fulfill the call of love in a distinctly different way. And it is indeed, it finds expression again and again and again within every craft. It finds expression where those who are older are passing on the craft, are passing on wisdom, and are blessing the next generation. I see this exemplified, for example, in 2 Timothy chapter 1, where Paul, more than likely writing from prison in Rome, more than likely recognizing that he's coming to the denouement of his own ministry and career, recognizing not only that he is older, but he probably will never leave prison. He writes to Timothy and urges him to fan into flame the gift of God that he has through the laying on of hands, and we have exactly what Fowler is talking about, where an older man is blessing a younger man with respect to the craft that they both have, in that case, both pastor preachers. But I wonder if this is the very case in every craft, in every calling. We have, as I mentioned, a faculty of business at the university, and one of the things I think is a gap that we have is that we do not have senior women, senior business women, to serve as models and mentors to our young women who we so eagerly want to see go into business. But where are the older senior women who are exemplars of the craft, who can pass on, you might say, the anointing, the blessing? Because part of what it means in our senior years is to realize that we are but here for a season. There, somebody had to break it to you gently. We are going to die. And that when we die, we pass on the legacy of our own craft, and that our legacy outlives us, but it only outlives us when we empower those who follow us. And part of this means, in some lines of work, including my own, that we do not cling to the office indefinitely. We do not cling to it so that those who follow us never get a chance to move into it in a timely fashion. We do not cling to it. Could it be, indeed, that there's a severe mercy, but a sheer genius as well in the U.S. presidency where, I'm sorry, Mr. Obama just can't say, I need more time. I really, if I could have another, I don't need a lot, maybe another 6 months beyond the 8 year. That's all I need, and then I can do fabulous stuff. I can bring peace to the Middle East. I can bring, give me the list. All I need is 6 more months. He ain't going to get it. That is, there's a severe mercy in a realization that there's a shelf life to many roles. Don't stay beyond your shelf life. I'm not saying it's 8 years. Well, maybe it is. Many administrative roles have a shelf life. But the point is that we let go of the levers of power primarily for this purpose, that we might be instruments of wisdom, blessing, and empowerment to the next generation, to the generation that follows. Fourthly, when we discern vocation and the ways in which God is calling us to love as God has loved us, we also need to ask the following question: What is the situation, the context? What are the circumstances in which I'm being called to fulfill the purposes of God in my life? That when I ask the question, what is the good work to which I'm called, we never ask this in a historical vacuum. We always ask it in light of the circumstances as they actually are, and the pivotal piece then comes next. Not as we wish they were. In the same principle about ourselves, we are who we are, not who we wish we were, maybe, but who we are. Maybe graciously accept that. Similarly, when it comes to discerning vocation in the midst of our circumstances, we name our reality, the circumstances in which God has called us to be, and name them not as we wish they were, but as they actually are. Which means, on the one hand, no nostalgia. No wishing back for the good old days. No wishing back for the days in which you fill in the blank. That Canada was like what? You name it. Oh, weren't those good old days, but alas, they're not like that. That's the point. They're not like that. And they likely won't be like that in your lifetime or mine. That is, the seasons have passed. We now live in new circumstances. Nostalgia does not serve us well. And thus, when Joelle and I were driving down the number 1 highway a couple of years ago outside of Vancouver, we had left Hope, the London Philharmonic, on Canadian Broadcasting Company. I mean, friends, Calgary Philharmonic is fabulous. The Vancouver Symphony Orchestra, fabulous. But you know, the London Philharmonic is as good as it gets. I mean, that's the top of the craft. And the CBC, bless them, Saturday afternoon, London Philharmonic. At the end of the concert, the narrator tells us that the conductor now has turned to the audience there in London and is inviting them to stand because the orchestra is going to lead them in a rendition of Britannia Rules the Waves. Well, oh my goodness. I think if I'm speeding and I explain to the officer, but the London Philharmonic, Britannia rules the waves. Officer, you need to understand, there were extenuating circumstances that led me to speed. I mean, frankly, it is magnificent to hear our dear friends, our British friends, singing Britannia Rules the Waves with the London Philharmonic Orchestra, as good as it gets. And when it was over, we turned the radio off and we're driving down the highway, and Joella says, but you know, they don't rule the waves. And I said, you're right, they don't. And in actual fact, it's been quite some time since they've ruled the waves. She says, how long? Well, I said, in my estimation, probably most historians would say it's been 100 years since they've ruled the waves. 100 years. Somebody needs to phone London. I mean, guys, you do not. However moving it was sheer nostalgia. And the sooner the United Kingdom can get with reality, the better. That is, they need to see where they actually fit in the order of nations. No nostalgia. Similarly for our country, to understand what role Canada has, along with Norway, Australia, Sweden. When I was doing work in my last job in Hanoi, Vietnam, I was struck by how the ambassadors from these middle powers recognized that they had a distinctive role to play, to see ourselves, to not wish we were anybody other than who we are, but to ask what is the role that we are called to play on the national stage requires seeing the national stage and ourselves in it as it actually is, not as we wish it was, which leads me then also to say this, not only no nostalgia, but no wishful thinking, which gains no edge, which gains no advantage. Yes, of course, sometimes we look at our circumstances and we don't realize that in actual fact there are possibilities there that we can't see. We need to be in conversation with others who help us to see possibilities because we're too pessimistic. We're feeling too sorry for ourselves because of these circumstances. But the main point is we need to be able to say these words. It is what it is. And then, just with a comma, no period there, we turn to the immortal words of the apostle in Ephesians chapter 3 when the apostle says, now to him who's able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine. That is, the genius of discerning vocation is to see our circumstances as they actually are, but to see them through the lens of the grace, of the possibilities of grace, the possibilities of God in the midst of those circumstances, which means, oh God, grant me this grace. We do not despair. We sustain a resilient hope. I know full well that one of the most pivotal roles I play as the senior executive officer of an academic institution, that one of the most senior roles I play is to cultivate a resilient hope in the midst of circumstances as they actually are, not as we wish them to be. And that thus part of my role within the institution is to help them, help the community, help us name reality, but do so in a way that sustains a resilient hope. I do not know your own circumstances. I do not know how you're naming your own reality, either with respect to your professional practice or the circumstances with your children or your parents or your neighborhood or your church or your city or whatever it happens to be. I just know this, that if we're going to discern the good work that God has called us to do, we need to be able to name the reality of the circumstances as they actually are, no nostalgia, no wishful thinking, but to do so through the lens of the possibilities of grace. And as often as not, what will happen is those who do not confess faith in Christ Jesus will think we are naive. Oh, you don't realize how bad the situation is. They'll think somehow that we're naive. And no, as they come alongside, they'll realize we're not naive. We're well aware of the forces of darkness and evil that intersect our world. It's just this. We know that evil will not have the last word. Okay, I was hoping for that. I realize that this is not a Pentecostal gathering, and therefore, no amen. But I just want to encourage you along there. I'll coach you. Evil does not have the last word. Thanks be to God. And therefore, we know Martin Luther King Jr.'s great line that the long arc of history bends towards the justice of God. And therefore, we invest energy now, knowing that the long arc of history bends towards the triumph of good. And thus we sustain, oh God, grant you grace, each one of you, the grace to not be women and men who come home at the end of the day cynical and despairing. Okay, you can go home at the end of the day cynical and despairing, but you don't come back to work the next morning cynical and despairing. I trust if you're single, I hope you've got good friends. And if you're married, I hope you're married as well as I do, where she can take it in the evening and I go back the next day, and she's an artist and she goes back the next day, and we are a source of mutual encouragement, the one to the other. You can't navigate these waters without that. Spouses, friends, companions on the road who are sources of animating grace. Fifth question. Now, of course, we need to move. We have to go here at some point to the Paschal mystery, to the one who calls us, realizing that indeed as God calls us to do God's work in God's world, as creators, as redeemers, that we need to ask the question, well, just how does God go about God's work? And for this, of course, we see the God-man, the embodied one, the Word embodied, and we ask, how did God fulfill God's purposes when God was walking magisterially, striding upon this earth? And of course, we know that it led him to the cross. That wasn't his vocation, actually. He was called to be a teacher and rabbi, but his work took him to the cross. It was not incidentally his vocation. He could not fulfill his vocation without going to the cross. And then the one who goes to the cross says this to each one of us: my son, my daughter, take up your cross and follow me. Could it be that the cross will intersect every vocation, that every one of us will be called in some form or another to carry the cross of Christ with respect to the ways in which God is calling us to do God's good work? And that therefore one of the questions I should be able to ask you, although if I'm not a close friend, I don't have the right to ask you, but somebody should be able to ask you this question: in what ways is God calling you to bear his cross? In what ways is God inviting you to allow suffering, pain, setback, and disappointment to intersect your life, your work, not as an aberration, but as something integral to the ways in which God is calling you to participate in the good work of God? For some, this work will be intrinsic. That is, there are some callings wherein suffering, pain, setback, and disappointment are inherent in the work. That is, you can't do them without realizing that this is what it costs. My youngest son is a pastor, and I'm not. And I used to be a pastor, and I'm not one now. And now that he's a pastor and has been one for a couple of years, I'm reminded, oh, maybe that's why I'm not a pastor. And what it has to do with is there's just no avoiding the phenomena of church politics. And academic politics I can manage. But church politics, it's just not the cross I was called to bear, I say. And I think there's truth to that. And my son manages this craziness with alacrity and grace and despair and then encouragement. But he says, no, Dad, this goes with the territory. That is, you don't be a pastor unless you're willing to say this goes with the territory. And for some, bearing the cross of Christ will be not intrinsic to their callings, but extrinsic to their callings. That is, the particular circumstances in which they're being called to do their work is one in which there are stress points, difficulties, yea, even suffering alongside of it. They're called, for example, to be a writer, but she's a single mom, and she has an elderly parent, and my goodness, where am I going to do my writing, given these circumstances in which I'm called to do this work? That is, that the cross of Christ is not intrinsic, but extrinsic, but the point I'm saying is this, that you probably should be able, I'm going to delete that. Delete the probably. All of us, if Jesus is taking us seriously, if Jesus is taking you seriously and your work seriously, all of us will be called to participate in and bear with Christ the pain, the suffering, the setback, and the disappointment of this world. The crucial piece, though, is this, that we bear it graciously, that we bear it, yea, even with alacrity, winsomely. We bear it not in a kind of mood of self-pity and an Eeyore, woe is me. Do you know who Eeyore is? But rather we bear it graciously and winsomely. What was the Apostle Paul's cross? Towards the end of 2 Corinthians, he speaks of the thorn in the flesh. What is this thorn in the flesh? When I was a seminary student back in the 70s, our New Testament prof, John Dom, said, well, there are 3 interpretations of the thorn in the flesh. When I was a seminary dean in the Philippines in the 1980s, our New Testament prof, Glenn Shelford, when I asked him what it was, he says, well, there are 6 or 7 different interpretations of the thorn in the flesh. And then when I was the dean at Regent College in Vancouver, and Gordon Fee was our professor of New Testament, and I asked him, he says, well, there's a dozen possible interpretations of the thorn in the flesh, meaning, Gordon said, we don't know. And maybe we're not meant to know. Maybe Paul indeed was saying, yes, the thorn is there, and it forces me to lean upon the grace of God. And indeed, earlier in 2 Corinthians, he says, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you, speaking cross language there. But it's not for all of us to know. We don't need to be voyeurs into it. I don't need to say, now, dear sisters and brothers, this morning, let me tell you about my cross. But I can only do so if you promise not to tell the faculty, because actually, it's them. So, kind of just between us. And then I go home at the end of the day, every day, oh, Lord, the faculty, woe is me, the faculty. I have to suffer, but fortunately, I am joined heirs with Christ, Romans 8:17, as I suffer with him, with these people. No. Please, no, I'm joking, and if you quote that back, if you say that to the faculty, I'll deny it, and I'll claim you're trying to slander me, and that it's your word against mine. So here we go. It's not for me to tell you in our voyeuristic time. I have close friends who know where I bear the cross. My wife knows where I bear the cross, but even Joella does not need every evening dinner to be a conversation about where I am bearing the cross of Christ. Thank you. That is, at dinner in the evening, she knows and I know we bear it quietly and winsomely. And I go to each day, Lord, grant me the grace for this day. And I am struck that indeed Paul is right when he says in 2 Corinthians that the thorn was that which catalyzed his continual moving towards gracious dependence upon the grace of God. And then finally, one of the themes that has emerged again and again over the last 25 years is that the only way we can love, and love genuinely and generously, is if we realize that the greatest threat to our capacity to fulfill our vocations is not external to us, but internal to us. It's not the economy. It's not the government. It's not the you fill in the blanks. Rather, could it be that the greatest threat to the fulfillment of our vocations is not external to us, but internal to us? Namely, that the greatest threat to the fulfillment of our vocations is fear. Will we have the courage to do what we are being called to do? Jesus, you know the story, the pericope well. Jesus comes to the small village of Bethany. He's visiting with two friends, two women friends, Mary and Martha. It's a very brief encounter, or better put, Luke describes it briefly. It could have happened over the course of an entire evening. We don't know. But very briefly, Luke describes the exchange. You all know it well. Martha is doing good work. She's in the kitchen. She's preparing a meal. She's doing what needs to be done. Bless her heart. Mary is doing good work. She is learning. She is studying. She's the model of the contemplative practices of attending to Jesus, attending to him as a disciple, as a follower, as a learner. Martha in the kitchen feels overwhelmed. So she leaves the kitchen and she speaks. She's frustrated with Mary, so she's going to speak to Mary. Actually, she doesn't. Rather than speaking to Mary, she speaks to Jesus. It's called triangulation. If you want to know what's going on here, that is when you don't address the issues at hand, but you go to somebody else. It's a very Asian approach for what it's worth. Except that she's speaking to the second person of the Holy Trinity. She's speaking to the Lord of glory and the Creator, the one through whom all things have been created and all things will be redeemed. And she basically says, not only am I disappointed with Mary, I'm disappointed with you. That is, tell Mary. So Mary has fallen short, and now Jesus needs to be told how to run the universe. I actually wonder how frequently we pray this way. How often do we pray, oh, may I draw something to your attention? Something where you are kind of falling short because other people are falling short. Lord, would you please fix these other people? Because it would sure make my life easier. And Jesus' response to her is so crucial. He does not call her to leave the kitchen. Rather, he says to her this, oh, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and worried about many things. Now, whenever the Lord says our name twice, it's time to take attention. That means in Old Testament speak, this is calling language. Whenever the name was spoken twice, the hearer, the recipient, needed to realize this is calling, this is vocation. And he did not call her out of the kitchen. Rather, he said, oh, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and worried about many things. Could it be that the greatest threat to the fulfillment of our vocations is fear? And that when we live, as Henry Nouwen puts it, in a culture of fear, it is doubly, if not exponentially, more difficult to be able to know how do we live with the grace that Jesus speaks to when he says to his disciples, do not worry about your lives. When we just assume that if you care, you are worried. That's part of how you know you care, is that you're worried. And Jesus says, do not worry about your life. Could it be that indeed if we're going to be able to discern what God is calling us to, we need to come to terms with the fears and anxieties that so easily percolate in our lives? 3.5 years ago, when I was a candidate potentially to be the president of Ambrose University, I was at the American Academy of Religion meetings in San Francisco, the AAR. And while there at the AAR, I met with two friends, Glenn Scorgi and David Bouchard, two former colleagues of mine. Had dinner with one of them one night, and he asked, are you going to be a candidate for the presidency of Ambrose? And I said, no, and here's all the reasons why not. And then the next night with David Bouchard, same thing. I actually asked him afterwards, did you guys, was this a tag team thing? And David says, oh, no, we had no idea. We both independently thought you should at least be looking at this. And I gave David all the same reasons why I should not be a candidate for the presidency of the university. We walked back from the Italian restaurant there in San Francisco, and it's a superb restaurant. If you're interested, I'll tell you where it is. We walked up the street to the Hilton, walked into the lobby of the Hilton, and David, as we were walking in, reached out and took my arm and then turned to face me, and he said, Gordon, what are you afraid of? I said, as one is wanted to say, it's at times, what do you mean? It's just, that's if you ever want to kind of get some social distance and time, what do you mean? He says, well, I think you know what I mean. And then he said this, if all the reasons you gave me back at the restaurant are legitimately the reasons, I'm fine. I'm cool with that. I'm at peace with that. But at least I think you should ask the question, what are you afraid of? And he nailed it. He was right. The one thing that kept me from throwing my name in the hat was fear. You don't need to know the particulars of that fear, but what I think you do need to have is colleagues, friends, sisters and brothers who walk alongside, those who have the capacity to ask you the question, what are you afraid of? And how might this be keeping you from embracing the good work to which you are called? All of that is just but a way of signaling the need for good conversation. My friends, my colleagues, my fellow learners, my sisters and brothers, we cannot navigate this road alone. When we ask the question, what is the good work to which we are called, we need others along the way. I need university students who challenge me with what God is doing in our world. I need a spouse and a friend and others who call me to recognize who I am, not who I wish I was. I need fellow women and men moving into our senior years to challenge us to move into these senior years well and graciously. I need others with me to name reality, to talk about graciously how we can encourage one another in the face of the cross and the suffering and the setback and the disappointment, and women and men who can ask us the question, what is it that you're afraid of? Don't try to navigate this road alone. May God grant you the grace of companions along the way and grace-filled conversation along the way. Thank you.